My name is Lena Carter. I'm in my late 30s, a mother of one, a project manager by profession, and until recently, a woman most people described as easygoing. That word followed me everywhere, at work, at family gatherings, in my marriage. Easygoing sounded kind, flexible, safe. What it really meant was that people assumed I wouldn't push back. I've always been quiet in a way that makes others comfortable. I listen more than I speak. I remember details people forget they ever shared. I don't rush to correct anyone. Because of that, I've often been underestimated, seen as agreeable rather than observant, calm rather than calculating, patient rather than precise. I learned early that when you don't demand attention, people tell the truth around you, sometimes accidentally, sometimes disguised as humor. This story begins at a holiday dinner, surrounded by family, wine glasses half full, plates still warm. It was meant to be ordinary, familiar, safe. And then my spouse made a joke about divorce. Everyone laughed, including him. I smiled too, because that's what I had always done. But something in me didn't laugh. Something took note. Because humor can expose real thoughts, especially when the speaker believes the audience won't take them seriously. What you're about to hear is not a story about rage, revenge, or public humiliation. There are no screaming matches, no dramatic exits, no viral moments. This is a documentary-style account of what happens when a woman listens carefully, stops explaining herself, and chooses clarity over chaos. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how small dismissals can become structural, how silence can be misread as weakness, and how preparation often looks like doing nothing at all. You'll hear how I moved from being invisible to being intentional, without raising my voice, without breaking my values, and without needing anyone to clap for me. This isn't about winning, it's about alignment. About taking a moment that others brushed off as a joke and treating it with the seriousness it deserved. About realizing that respect doesn't always disappear loudly. Sometimes it fades quietly, right in front of other people. I'm telling this story now because I wish someone had told it to me earlier. Not as a warning, but as permission. To trust what you hear, even when it's wrapped in laughter. To believe that your calm doesn't obligate you to tolerate erasure, and to understand that choosing yourself doesn't require cruelty, only resolve. As you listen, I invite you to notice your own reactions, the moments that feel familiar, the places where you might have laughed something off that didn't sit right. Have you ever smiled through a moment that quietly asked you to pay attention? To the people around me, I was dependable in a way that rarely drew attention. I was the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, who noticed when the milk was running low before anyone else did, who smoothed over awkward moments with a gentle comment and a calm smile. At family gatherings, I helped without being asked. At work, I filled gaps before they became problems. In my marriage, I carried the invisible weight, the logistics, the planning, the emotional temperature of the room. No one ever called it labor. They called it natural. My spouse used to say I was low maintenance, as if that were a compliment. Friends would laugh and say he was lucky I wasn't dramatic. His family liked me because I was so understanding. That word followed me too. Understanding. As if my capacity to see others clearly meant I didn't need to be seen at all. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I believed in the role. I thought being steady meant being strong. I thought not reacting meant I was mature. I told myself that harmony mattered more than acknowledgement, that love didn't need constant validation. I was proud of my composure. I mistook endurance for depth. Over time, the shape of my presence became predictable. I was the background constant, the person who would adapt, the one whose preferences were flexible, whose opinions were whatever you think is fine, whose silence was interpreted as agreement. When decisions were made, they were often announced to me, not discussed with me. And because I rarely objected, it seemed reasonable to everyone else. I became familiar with furniture in my own life. At dinners, conversations would drift around me. People spoke freely, sometimes carelessly, assuming I wasn't keeping score. They joked, they teased, they made offhand comments that landed softly enough to be dismissed, and because I didn't flinch, they assumed nothing had landed at all. But I was listening. I always had been. There's a particular invisibility that comes from being competent and calm. When you don't create friction, people stop checking where you stand. They stop asking how things feel on your side. They project their assumptions onto your quiet. And if you don't interrupt that story, it becomes permanent. My spouse, especially, grew comfortable with that version of me. He spoke about our life as if it were stable by default, as if my presence were a guarantee rather than a choice. He'd make plans that affected us both and present them as done deals. He'd tease me in front of others in ways that earned laughs because I never corrected him. The joke always landed safely, cushioned by my silence. I told myself this was intimacy, that comfort looked like this, that not every thought needed to be shared, not every comment challenged. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I didn't realize yet was that peace without respect is just quiet erosion. To outsiders, we looked solid, balanced, functional. I was the calm counterweight to his confidence, the one who grounded things. People would say, "Lena keeps everything together," and smile at me as if that were a gift. I smiled back because I didn't know what else to do with that sentence. Inside, though, something subtle was happening, a recalibration so slow it didn't register as pain, more like pressure. The kind that builds when you're always the one absorbing, adjusting, accommodating, when your identity becomes defined by how easy you make things for others. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I was just absent from my own center. At that holiday dinner, the one everyone remembers as harmless, that's who I was to them. The reliable one, the quiet one, the woman who wouldn't take a joke too seriously, the wife who would laugh it off and move on. They had no reason to expect anything else, and that's what made what came next possible. The joke landed halfway through dessert. Plates had been cleared, wine refilled. Someone had just told a story about a messy breakup. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of anecdote people trade during the holidays when conversation drifts into personal territory. There was laughter, a few sympathetic nods, and then my spouse leaned back in his chair, smiled and said, "Careful, that's how marriages end. Guess I should start practicing for my own divorce." He laughed before anyone else could. A casual practice sound, the kind that signals you're supposed to join in. The table followed his lead, a ripple of chuckles. Someone added, "Oh, stop, you two are fine." Another joked about alimony. The moment moved quickly, like these things always do. Humor has momentum. It doesn't like to be examined. I smiled. I lifted my glass. I didn't correct him. But something in my body went still. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't even hurt. Not exactly. It was recognition. The kind that feels like a quiet click inside your chest, as if a piece of information has just slotted into place. I remember thinking, that wasn't for them. That was for me. Not a threat, not an announcement, a test. People often think jokes are harmless because they're framed as hypothetical, but jokes also give cover. They allow someone to say a real thought and retreat if it's challenged. "I was kidding. You're too sensitive. Can't you take a joke?" Humor creates plausible deniability. I'd lived long enough to know that. Around the table, the conversation had already shifted. Someone was talking about travel plans. Someone else was reaching for more pie. The moment was over for everyone else. That's what made it powerful. No one else felt the need to hold on to it. I did. I noticed the way he didn't look at me when he said it. The way he waited for laughter before glancing in my direction was just long enough to confirm I was smiling. The way his shoulders relaxed afterward, as if something had been released. That night, as we drove home, the car was quiet. He hummed along to the radio, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. I watched the city lights blur past and said nothing. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I wanted to understand what had just happened without his interpretation layered on top. If I had asked him about it then, he would have waved it away. I knew that. He would have said it was just a joke, that I was reading into it, that everyone laughed. And maybe, at an earlier point in my life, I would have accepted that explanation and filed the discomfort under overthinking. But this time, I didn't need his clarification. I trusted my own perception. A joke doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a place where the thought has already been rehearsed. Maybe lightly, maybe playfully, but rehearsed nonetheless. I didn't confront him. I didn't sulk. I didn't withdraw affection. I went on exactly as before. We talked about schedules, groceries, and our child's school project. I laughed at the right moments. I made coffee the next morning. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, I started paying attention differently. That comment became a reference point, not a wound, but a marker. The first small cut that didn't bleed, didn't scar, but altered the way I saw the shape of things. I replayed it once, then stopped. I didn't need to obsess. I just needed to remember. Because when something is said publicly, even as a joke, it tells you what the speaker believes will be tolerated. And in that moment, surrounded by people who loved us, he believed that idea, divorce as a punchline, would pass without consequence. He was right about one thing. No one else took it seriously. After that dinner, nothing dramatic followed. That's what made it easy to dismiss. Easy enough that, for a while, even I questioned whether I should. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. Mornings were busy. Evenings were practical. Weekends were filled with errands and quiet routines. On the surface, the joke dissolved into memory like sugar and tea. But something had shifted in how I listened. Once you notice a pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. The comments didn't come often, and they were never overt. They were small, well-timed, always cushioned with humor or plausible innocence. A remark about how I was too calm to ever leave. A half smile when someone asked how long we'd been married, followed by, "Depends who you ask." Always said lightly, always with an audience. And each time there was laughter. Each time I stayed composed. I told myself these were nothing. That long marriages develop inside jokes. That I was being overly analytical. I reminded myself that he wasn't cruel, that he provided, that he showed up in the ways people recognize easily. I compared my situation to worse ones and felt foolish for even noticing the discomfort. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through aggression, but through repetition wrapped in charm. The more it happened, the more I adjusted internally. I learned which reactions were expected of me and which would feel inconvenient to others. I became efficient at smoothing moments before they grew edges. If a comment landed slightly off, I reframed it in my head before it could settle. He didn't mean it that way. Everyone jokes like this. It's not worth a conversation. What I didn't realize was that each rationalization required a small withdrawal from myself. I began to notice how rarely I was asked what I wanted, only what I was okay with. How decisions were framed in ways that assumed my flexibility. If I hesitated, there was surprise, sometimes irritation, quickly masked by reassurance. "You're usually so chill about this," as if my calm were a contract I'd signed. At gatherings, people would look to me to absorb tension. If someone overstepped, I was expected to soften it. If he teased me, I was expected to laugh. My role had become unspoken, but clearly understood. Keep things light, keep things moving, keep things comfortable. And I complied, not because I lacked awareness, but because I believed stability required sacrifice. I believed love meant choosing your battles carefully. I believed silence could be generous. But silence, repeated too often, becomes a habit others rely on. I started to notice the imbalance in what was shared. He spoke freely about his frustrations, his hypotheticals, and his jokes about escape. I kept my doubts contained, neatly folded away. I didn't want to be the one who introduced heaviness. I didn't want to be seen as sensitive or dramatic or humorless. So I normalized it for him, for others, for myself. The danger in that isn't immediate harm, it's a gradual erosion. You begin to measure your comfort by how little space it takes up. You pride yourself on being easy to be with. You mistake adaptability for connection. I still functioned well, better than well. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. That's the thing about quiet imbalance. It rarely announces itself, it just settles in. And somewhere in that settling, I began to understand that the joke at the holiday dinner hadn't been isolated. It had been an introduction, a signal of what could be said without challenge, of how much seriousness could be disguised as humor and still pass as acceptable. I didn't confront it, not yet. Instead, I watched myself participate in my own minimization. I watched how quickly I translated discomfort into tolerance. And for the first time, I asked a question I'd never allowed myself before. What does it cost me to keep this easy? I didn't answer it immediately, but I stopped dismissing it. It became clear to me slowly, not through a single moment, but through accumulation, that I wasn't just choosing silence. I had been cast in it. Roles form quietly in relationships. They're rarely assigned outright. No one sits you down and explains who you're expected to be. Instead, expectations crystallize through repetition, through what's rewarded, through what's ignored, through what causes discomfort when you step outside it. My role was reliability without resistance. I was the one who would handle things, the one who wouldn't complicate plans with too many questions, the one whose emotional steadiness made everything else feel manageable. When something needed to be done, it landed with me. When something needed to be absorbed, it was mine to hold. And because I did it well, no one thought to ask whether I wanted to keep doing it. At home, this looked like unspoken assumptions, that I would adjust my schedule, that I would remember details, that I would smooth over moods. Decisions were made in a tone that implied consultation, but arrived already formed. I figured this would be fine with you. And because I rarely objected, it became true. In social settings, my role was even clearer. I was the stabilizer. If he teased me, it was safe because I would soften it. If someone crossed a line, I'd redirect. People trusted me to keep things comfortable. And comfort, I learned, can be a trap when it's one-sided. What struck me most wasn't malice. It was certain. A confidence that I would always be there in the same shape. Calm, accommodating, predictable. My spouse didn't worry about losing me, not because of deep security, but because the version of me he knew had never challenged the conditions of staying. I had become useful in a very specific way. The realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I saw how my strengths, emotional regulation, patience, and foresight had been interpreted as passivity. How my refusal to escalate had been mistaken for an inability to leave. How my loyalty had been translated into permanence. And I saw my own part in it. I had accepted the role because it aligned with how I wanted to see myself. Reasonable. Grounded, not reactive. But somewhere along the way, the role stopped being something I chose and became something I was expected to perform. That's when the jokes about divorce began to feel different. Not like humor, but like boundary testing. As if the idea of my absence was being explored casually, safely, without risk. Because in that script, I wasn't the one who walked away. I was the one who endured. I started to understand that roles persist because they're convenient. They simplify dynamics. They allow one person to expand while the other remains. And unless someone disrupts that balance, it remains. I didn't disrupt it yet. Instead, I studied it. I watched how quickly discomfort appeared when I paused before agreeing, how surprised I was when I said I needed time to think. Small changes, barely noticeable, but informative. They told me exactly how narrow my assigned space had become. And in that awareness, something in me shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. I stopped seeing myself as misunderstood. I started seeing myself as underestimated. There's power in that distinction, Because misunderstanding invites explanation, underestimation invites preparation. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand recognition. I simply stopped performing without question. I let silences linger. I let decisions wait. I allowed my presence to take up a little more room, even if no one commented on it. They didn't notice, not really. They still saw me as I had been. And that was the moment I realized how deeply the role had set in, and how free I was to move beneath it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no confrontation that forced clarity. It happened on a weekday afternoon, in a moment so ordinary it almost escaped notice. I was alone in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with my black notebook open in front of me. Sunlight was cutting across the wood in a way that made dust visible in the air. I remember that detail because it made everything feel slower, suspended. I had been reviewing schedules, school dates, work deadlines, and upcoming travel. The usual mental choreography I managed without thinking. And then I paused. Not because something was wrong on the page, but because I realized how much of my life existed in anticipation of others. Every note, every reminder, every plan assumed my role as a stabilizer, the one who adjusted, the one who absorbed. I closed the notebook and sat back. For the first time, I didn't ask myself what needed to be done next. I asked something else instead. If I stopped compensating, what would actually happen? The question felt dangerous in its simplicity. It wasn't about leaving. It wasn't even about change. It was about observation, about removing myself as the constant and seeing the system respond. In that quiet, the holiday joke resurfaced, not emotionally, but analytically. I replayed it without defensiveness, without minimizing, just as data, a statement made publicly, laughed at, uncorrected, filed away. And I saw it clearly then. The joke hadn't unsettled me because it suggested divorce. It unsettled me because it revealed how replaceable my presence was assumed to be, how my absence could be imagined casually, without fear, because my individuality had been flattened into function. That realization didn't hurt, it clarified. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, not sadness, but resolve. A decision not to confront, but to recenter. To stop managing the narrative on everyone else's behalf. To let reality speak for itself. That afternoon, I didn't make a plan. I didn't strategize. I simply made one internal commitment. I will no longer protect others from the consequences of how they treat me. It sounds dramatic written out like that, but in practice, it was subtle. It meant I stopped preemptively smoothing. I stopped filling gaps before they were acknowledged. I allowed small inconveniences to exist without rushing to erase them. And I watched. I watched confusion arise where there used to be ease. I watched mild frustration surface when I didn't immediately adapt. I watched how quickly my steadiness had been relied upon without being valued. No one accused me of changing. No one confronted me. But I could feel the shift in the air, like pressure adjusting in a sealed room. Inside, something else changed too. I stopped narrating myself as patient and started seeing myself as intentional. I stopped equating calm with compliance. I realized that silence, when chosen, can be a boundary. That day wasn't a turning point that others could see. There was no marker, no announcement. But it was the moment I stepped back into myself. The moment I reclaimed authorship over my own presence. And once you do that, even quietly, everything else begins to reorganize around it. When I stopped filling every space, people didn't immediately notice the silence. They noticed the absence of convenience. At first, it showed up in small ways. A missed reminder. A decision that waited instead of resolving itself. A question was returned instead of answered. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just a subtle refusal to overfunction. My silence was no longer automatic, it was deliberate. When my spouse made an offhand comment that would once have earned an easy laugh from me, I simply looked at him, not coldly, not challengingly, just present. The moment stretched. He filled it with a half smile, then changed the subject. He didn't ask why I hadn't laughed. He didn't need to. The absence of my usual response had already registered. Others interpreted this new quiet in predictable ways. Some assumed I was tired, others thought I was stressed. A few likely believed I was being passive-aggressive. None of them considered that I might be choosing when to speak. That's the thing about people who mistake your composure for weakness. They can't imagine it as a strategy. I didn't correct their assumptions. I didn't owe them clarity yet. I was still learning what happened when I allowed myself to take up internal space without explaining it away. In conversations, I spoke less, but when I did, I was precise. I answered what was asked, not what was implied. I stopped cushioning my words to protect others from discomfort. If something didn't sit right, I didn't smooth it over for them. I let the moment stand. The shift unsettled him more than anything I could have said. He'd glance at me as if waiting for a cue I no longer provided. When plans were discussed, he'd pause, unsure whether to assume my agreement. That uncertainty was new and revealing. Still, there was no confrontation. Silence has a way of exposing dynamics without naming them. It creates a mirror. People see themselves reflected back in what you no longer do for them. I began to understand how much labor my quiet had been performing, how it had edited his words in real time, how it had absorbed the impact so others wouldn't have to feel it. When I withdrew that buffer, even slightly, the imbalance became visible. And yet, no one accused me of being cruel, because I wasn't. I was still kind, still fair, still engaged. I simply stopped overextending myself to maintain an illusion of ease. My silence wasn't punishment, it was alignment. Internally, I felt steadier than I had in years. There was no adrenaline, no fear, just a sense of groundedness. I wasn't waiting for validation. I wasn't bracing for a reaction. I was observing, collecting information, allowing patterns to complete themselves. And the more I stayed quiet, the more others spoke. They filled the space with explanations, with jokes, with justifications, things they had never felt the need to articulate before. That's when I realized silence doesn't create tension. It reveals where tension already exists. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was simply no longer performing invisibility. And that difference, subtle as it was, set everything else in motion. While everything looked the same on the outside, my internal posture had changed completely. That's what no one noticed. They mistook continuity of behavior for continuity of intention. I was still showing up, still fulfilling responsibilities, still calm. So they assumed nothing fundamental had shifted. They didn't realize that I had stopped operating on autopilot and started operating on record. I began documenting, not in a dramatic, paranoid way, but methodically. Dates, conversations, decisions that affected me but weren't discussed, comments framed as jokes, patterns of assumption. I wrote them down in my black notebook at first, then transferred the important ones into a private digital file, not to weaponize them, but to see them clearly without emotion blurring the edges. When you're inside a dynamic for a long time, memory becomes selective. You forget how often something happens because each instance feels minor. Documentation removes that fog. It turns impressions into evidence, not for court, necessarily, but for yourself. I also started learning, quietly. I read about financial structures, not because I suspected betrayal, but because I realized how little visibility I had. I reviewed shared accounts, retirement plans, and property documents. I noticed how often decisions had been made for efficiency without my direct involvement. None of it was illegal. None of it was explosive, but it was asymmetrical. I asked questions casually, neutral tone, no accusations, just curiosity. Why is this set up this way? What happens if one of us wants to make a change? The answers were often vague, or confident in a way that assumed I wouldn't push further. I didn't push. Instead, I listened. At the same time, I worked on myself in ways that didn't announce themselves. I reconnected with professional contacts. I updated my credentials. I explored what independence would actually look like, not emotionally, but logistically. income, time, support. I wanted facts, not fantasies. No one noticed this either because preparation doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like routine. It blends in. At home, my spouse remained comfortable. The jokes didn't stop entirely, but they became less frequent, less certain. Sometimes he'd catch himself and glance at me as if checking whether the ground was still soft. I gave nothing away. I wasn't cold. I wasn't distant. I was present without being porous. What they never noticed was that my silence had changed function. It was no longer absorbent. It was selective. I chose what entered and what stayed outside. I stopped internalizing what wasn't mine to carry. This wasn't about catching anyone in a lie. It was about understanding the structure I was living inside. And once you see the structure, you can't pretend you don't. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, grounded in information, detached in the best way. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was waiting for a moment to decide. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that whatever happened next needed to be deliberate, irreversible, and aligned with my values. They never noticed the shift because they had mistaken my quiet for stasis. They didn't know that under that quiet, everything was being repositioned. The reveal didn't come from a dramatic discovery. There was no single document, no shocking message, no secret exposed in a moment of betrayal. What I uncovered was quieter than that and far more definitive. It arrived as clarity. After weeks of reading, reviewing, and asking neutral questions, a full picture began to form. Not of wrongdoing, but of imbalance. How much control had slowly centralized without discussion, of how my trust had been interpreted as consent, of how the system we called shared had been structured to function smoothly without my active participation. And that realization landed with surprising calm. I saw how financial decisions had been optimized for speed rather than transparency, how long-term planning assumed my continued flexibility, how my role as a stabilizer had been quietly baked into every projection of the future. There was nothing malicious in the design, but it was not neutral. The leverage wasn't hidden money or secrets. The leverage was that I finally understood the architecture. When you understand how something is built, you understand where it's fragile. It depends on you, where your presence isn't optional, just unacknowledged. I realized how much of our stability relied on my invisible labor, emotional, logistical, relational. How many systems assumed my continued participation without accounting for my autonomy? And I realized something else too. I was far more prepared to stand alone than anyone had assumed. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful in a dramatic sense. It made me feel steady, like standing on solid ground after realizing you'd been balancing on something narrow for years. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. That night, I sat alone again, notebook open, and wrote a single sentence: I can leave without chaos. Not because it would be easy, not because it wouldn't hurt, but because I had done the quiet work that makes the transition possible without collapse. And in that moment, the holiday joke finally resolved itself. It lost its power, not because it was forgiven or forgotten, but because it no longer defined the frame. The idea of divorce was no longer something spoken about to me. It was something I understood fully from the inside out. I hadn't decided to leave yet. That's important. Clarity doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it simply removes fear. And once fear is gone, choice becomes real. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and slept deeply. Not with answers, but with certainty. Whatever came next would not be reactive, it would not be loud, and it would not be accidental. It would be mine. Clarity creates a strange kind of stillness. Once I understood the structure I was living inside, the urgency dissolved. I wasn't trapped, I wasn't cornered, and because of that, I didn't need to rush. For the first time in a long while, I had real options, and I allowed myself to look at each one without flinching. I could stay exactly as I was, adjust my expectations, continue the quiet negotiations I'd already mastered. Many people do this successfully. They make peace with the imbalance by shrinking their needs. I knew I was capable of that. I had been doing it for years. I could confront him directly, lay everything out, name the joke, name the pattern, demand recalibration. There was a version of this path where things improved temporarily, where apologies were made, where promises filled the space my silence had once occupied. And then there was the option I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, not because it was extreme, but because it was final. Leaving, not in anger, not as punishment, but as a decision rooted in alignment, in the understanding that being respected only after you threaten to disappear isn't respect, it's fear management. I watched him during this period with new eyes, not critically, honestly. I noticed how often he assumed my presence, how easily he joked about loss without imagining it, how discomfort appeared when I didn't smooth things over, but how quickly he relied on me again once equilibrium returned. I asked myself a difficult question. If nothing changed from this point forward, would I still want this life? The answer came without drama. No, that was the moment. Not when I imagined leaving, but when staying became the more costly option. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't test it by hinting. I simply accepted it internally. And once accepted, it stopped feeling heavy. It felt clean, like setting something down after carrying it longer than necessary. The irreversibility mattered to me. I didn't want a decision that could be negotiated away by temporary effort or emotional appeals. I wanted one that honored what I had learned about myself, that I didn't need to be convinced to matter. That night, we sat on the couch watching something forgettable. He laughed at a line. I smiled. Everything looked normal. And in that normalcy, I understood something crucial. The absence of visible crisis doesn't mean the presence of alignment. I went to bed knowing the direction I would take, not because he pushed me out, but because I finally stepped back in. Once the decision was made, I became very careful with my energy. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that would raise alarms. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I didn't start fights to justify what I already knew. I moved the way you do when something matters enough not to be announced. Quietly, precisely. The first steps were logistical. I scheduled consultations under the guise of routine appointments. I gathered information about legal processes, not to accelerate anything, but to remove uncertainty. Knowing timelines, options, and boundaries gave me a sense of containment. There would be no improvisation. I organized documents methodically: birth certificates, financial records, insurance information, everything copied, nothing removed. Transparency mattered to me, if to no one else. I wasn't trying to disappear. I was preparing to transition. At work, I stabilized my position. I confirmed projects, reinforced professional relationships, and ensured my role was secure. Independence isn't just emotional, it's structural. I wanted to know that when the moment came, I wouldn't be negotiating from fear. At home, I maintained normalcy. We talked about schedules, we coordinated childcare, we made plans for the coming weeks. From the outside, nothing shifted. That was intentional. I didn't want his behavior to change in response to my preparation. I wanted my decision to stand on its own, unaffected by reaction. There's a discipline to moving in silence. It requires restraint, the urge to explain yourself, to seek validation, to preempt misunderstanding. It all has to be managed. I reminded myself that clarity doesn't require consensus. And through all of this, he remained unaware, comfortable, certain. He still joked occasionally, less confidently now, but still within the assumption that I would remain. That assumption had a weight to it, a weight I no longer carried. I wasn't deceiving him. I was simply no longer managing his comfort at the expense of my own. The irony is that silence can look like nothing, when in reality it's everything aligning beneath the surface. Every step I took reduced chaos later. Every document gathered was an act of respect for myself and for the life we had built, even as I prepared to step out of it. I slept well during this time, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. There's a deep rest that comes from no longer arguing with yourself. And still no one noticed. They never do when you've been quiet all along. The first consequences didn't announce themselves with conflict. They arrived in confusion. Small things started to slip, not because I was neglectful, but because I had stopped compensating in advance. A deadline was missed, not catastrophic, just inconvenient. A plan had to be revised because I hadn't quietly adjusted around it. A conversation stalled where it once would have flowed. At first, the response was mild irritation, then puzzlement, then subtle frustration that didn't know where to land. My spouse felt it before he understood it. I could see it in the way he paused before speaking, as if waiting for me to step in and translate. In the way he double-checked plans, he used to assume I had already managed. In the way his tone shifted, slightly defensive, slightly uncertain, when I asked clarifying questions instead of smoothing things over. "What do you think?" he asked more often now. Not with curiosity, with unease. Because when the stabilizer stops absorbing, instability doesn't look like chaos. It looks like exposure. He began to feel the absence of something he'd never named. The emotional cushioning, the quiet editing, the way I used to catch things before they landed hard. Without that, interactions required more effort, more responsibility, more presence. And that effort was unfamiliar. Others noticed too, though they couldn't articulate it. Friends commented that I seemed different. Calmer, they said, more reserved. Some assumed I was tired, some assumed I was busy. No one guessed the truth, that I had simply reclaimed my attention. The irony was that I wasn't doing less. I was doing exactly what was required, no more, no less. And that recalibration shifted the entire dynamic. He began to feel the loss before he understood the cause. That's how consequence works when it's quiet. It doesn't accuse, it reveals. There were moments when he seemed close to asking, close to noticing the pattern. But each time he retreated into familiarity, made a joke, changed the subject, reached for the version of me that used to make everything easier. I didn't reappear, not out of cruelty, out of consistency. Because once you stop offering yourself as a buffer, others are forced to encounter their own edges. And that encounter can be disorienting, even painful, especially when they've mistaken your presence for permanence. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were cumulative. A growing sense of imbalance where there had once been ease, a feeling of something missing without knowing its name. And through it all, I remained calm, not detached, not cold, just no longer carrying what wasn't mine. The moment he realized something was wrong did not arrive with anger. It arrived with anxiety. Not the loud kind, the quiet, restless kind that shows up when a familiar structure begins to wobble and no one knows where to brace it. He didn't accuse, he didn't confront. He hovered. It started with questions that sounded caring on the surface but carried uncertainty underneath. "Are you okay lately?" "You've been quiet, more than usual." "Did I do something?" He asked them casually, usually while multitasking, loading the dishwasher, checking his phone, tying his shoes, as if naming the concern directly might give it too much weight, as if saying it sideways would make it disappear. I answered truthfully, but selectively. "I'm fine. I'm just thinking more. I'm tired." None of that was a lie, and none of it invited negotiation. What he was sensing wasn't withdrawal. It was detachment from obligation. And because our relationship had never been built around overt conflict, he didn't have a script for this moment. There was no argument to reference, no explosion to contain, no single apology that would reset things. That's what made him uneasy. He began trying to restore familiarity, not intentionally manipulative, just instinctive. He reached for the tools that had always worked before. More humor, more physical closeness, more future talk. He spoke about upcoming plans with renewed enthusiasm, as if certainty itself could anchor me back into place. He referenced shared history casually, inside jokes, old trips, milestones we had passed together. He reminded me, without saying it outright, that we were established. But an establishment without attentiveness doesn't feel like safety. It feels like an assumption. I noticed how his affection had a question embedded in it now, a quiet request for reassurance. He wanted confirmation that the ground beneath him was still solid, that I was still playing my part. I didn't provide it, not because I wanted to punish him, because I no longer wanted to perform reassurance when clarity was already settled inside me. One evening, he tried a different approach. He softened his voice, sat closer, asked if I felt appreciated. The question was careful, almost rehearsed. I paused before answering. "I feel aware," I said. He blinked. "Aware of what?" "Of myself." That answer unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because awareness can't be argued with. After that, his efforts intensified, not dramatically, but persistently. He began checking in more often, asking opinions before deciding, offering help without being prompted. These were all things that might have mattered deeply months earlier. But timing matters. Care that arrives after disengagement feels different than care that exists as a constant. It feels reactive, not relational. It doesn't rebuild trust. It highlights how conditional attention has been. And I could feel it in my body. The gestures didn't soften me. They clarified my decision. He wasn't changing because he had reflected deeply. He was adjusting because he felt loss approaching. There's a difference. One evening, he mentioned the holiday dinner again, lightly, almost joking. "I guess I shouldn't make jokes about divorce anymore, huh?" He smiled when he said it, not playfully, nervously, like someone tossing a rope toward a ledge they're afraid they've already stepped off. The room was quiet. I didn't smile. I didn't sigh. I didn't accuse. I looked at him calmly and said, "I heard you." That was all. No explanation, no lecture, no emotional surge, just acknowledgement. And something in his face shifted, not defensiveness, not irritation, fear, because being heard is very different from being forgiven. And in that moment, he understood that the joke hadn't been dismissed. It had been registered, filed away, taken seriously. He tried to speak, stopped, tried again. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know," I said. And that was the problem. Meaning wasn't the issue, orientation was. After that conversation, he became noticeably unsettled. His movements lost some of their ease. He watched me more closely, as if looking for signs of recovery, as if waiting for me to revert. I didn't. I was still kind, still fair, still engaged in daily life, but I was no longer invested in managing his comfort or smoothing his uncertainty. I had crossed an internal threshold that could not be uncrossed. He began to panic, not openly, but internally. I could see it in the way he overcorrected, in how he tried to anticipate my needs without actually asking what they were, in how he framed his efforts as proof. "See, I'm trying. I'm paying attention. I'm here." But I didn't need proof anymore, because I wasn't deciding whether he could change. I was deciding whether I wanted to stay in a structure where change only arrived under threat. At one point, he asked directly, "Are you thinking about leaving?" The question was fragile, bare. I didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, he felt it. Not the answer, but the possibility. "I'm thinking about what it means to stay," I said finally. That was the moment everything became irreversible. Because once you frame staying as a choice instead of an obligation, the dynamic collapses. The old leverage disappears. Habit no longer holds power. He tried to fix things after that, truly. More conversation, more presence, more effort. But by then, the foundation had shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting for improvement. I wasn't negotiating. I had already stepped out of the emotional position that made repair meaningful. This is the part people misunderstand when they say, "But couldn't it have been fixed?" Fixing assumes something is broken. This wasn't broken. It was complete. Complete in the sense that it had reached its natural end, not through explosion, but through clarity. Through the realization that I no longer recognized myself in the role I was being asked to continue performing. And no amount of late attention could make me forget what it cost to get here. By the time he understood the seriousness, The decision had already passed its quiet point of no return. Too late, not because he was evil, too late because I was done negotiating my worth. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning. No special setup, no dramatic timing. The house was quiet in the way it gets when the world hasn't fully woken up yet. Light filtered through the windows. Coffee sat untouched on the counter, cooling slowly. Everything about the moment suggested normalcy, and that felt important to me. I didn't want the confrontation to feel like an event. I wanted it to feel like a fact. He knew something was coming. I could tell by the way he watched me sit down, by the way his body tensed slightly, as if preparing for impact. People expect conflict to arrive loudly. He was bracing for volume. I didn't give him any. "I've made a decision," I said. My voice was even, not careful, not brittle, just clear. He nodded once as if that might help him absorb it. "Okay, I'm going to leave the marriage." There was a pause. Not the kind filled with interruption, but the kind where reality rearranges itself. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse. His first response was procedural. Are you serious?" "Yes." That was all I needed to say. He asked why, of course. People always ask why, as if a list might open a negotiation. I didn't offer one, not because I lacked reasons, but because I refused to turn my clarity into a debate. "I don't feel aligned here anymore," I said, and I haven't for a while. He tried to anchor the conversation to moments, to improvements, to effort. He mentioned the things he'd been doing differently, the ways he'd tried to show up, the care he'd recently demonstrated. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct his timeline. When he finished, I said, "I believe you're trying. I also believe that I shouldn't have to become distant for that to happen." That was the closest thing to a confrontation in the room. There was no shouting, no tears, at least not then. Just the slow realization that effort made too late doesn't undo orientation. That attention offered in response to withdrawal doesn't feel the same as attention given freely. He asked if there was anything he could do. I answered honestly, "Mama." That answer landed harder than anger would have, because anger implies attachment. Not now implies completion. We talked about logistics, about our child, about timing, about how to make the transition as steady as possible. The conversation stayed grounded because I stayed grounded. I wasn't there to release emotion. I was there to communicate reality. At one point he said, "You're so calm." I nodded. I've already done the emotional part, and that was true. The confrontation didn't end with resolution or closure. It ended with acceptance. Uneven, incomplete, but real. There were things he still didn't understand. There were things I didn't explain. I didn't need him to fully grasp my reasoning. I needed him to respect my decision. And for the first time in a long time, he did. Not because I demanded it, because I no longer needed anything else from him. The first thing people expect after a separation like this is bitterness. They wait for anger to surface, for resentment to spill out in sideways comments or sharp retellings. They assume there must be relief laced with vindication or grief dressed up as strength. When they don't see those things, they seem confused, almost disappointed. But that isn't my experience. What I feel now is spaciousness. Not the kind that comes from escape, but the kind that comes from alignment, from no longer living in quiet contradiction with yourself, from waking up and realizing your internal voice no longer has to negotiate its existence. I am still calm, still thoughtful, still someone who listens more than she speaks. Those traits didn't disappear when I left. They were never the problem. The difference now is that they belong to me again, not to a role, not to a system that depended on my silence. I make decisions without preemptively calculating how they will land. I speak when something matters, and I let things pass when they don't, without explaining the difference to anyone. I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. My life is quieter now, but not emptier. There are fewer expectations pressing in from all sides, fewer unspoken contracts. I feel present in my own days in a way I didn't realize I was missing. Not euphoric, not constantly empowered, just whole. I've noticed something else too. People respond differently to me now. Not because I've become harder or colder, but because my boundaries are clearer. My silence no longer invites assumption. My calm no longer guarantees compliance. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes the way others engage. I don't explain my past. I don't rewrite it to justify my present. I let it stand as it was, a chapter that taught me the cost of being endlessly accommodating without being fully seen. If there's pride in me, it isn't about leaving. It's about how I left. Without spectacle, without cruelty, without losing myself in the process. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to be believed by everyone. I needed to live in a way that felt internally consistent, and I do. Sometimes I think back to that holiday dinner, to the joke that started everything, not with anger, but with clarity. It wasn't the moment that broke the marriage. It was the moment that revealed it. And I'm grateful I listened, because who I am now is not someone hardened by loss, but someone sharpened by truth. Someone who understands that quiet doesn't mean small, and that choosing yourself doesn't require noise. It only requires honesty. There's a certain kind of story people expect when a marriage ends. They expect betrayal, or rage, or a final unforgivable moment that makes everything make sense in hindsight. They want a villain they can point to, a scene they can quote, a reason that feels loud enough to justify the ending. This story doesn't offer that. What it offers instead is something quieter and far more common. A relationship doesn't always end because someone did something terrible. Sometimes it ends because one person stopped being fully present as themselves and the other never noticed. Sometimes it ends because respect was slowly replaced by assumption, and care became reactive instead of intentional. The joke about divorce wasn't the cause, it was the signal. It revealed a comfort with my erasure, a belief that my presence was guaranteed. And humor, especially casual humor, has a way of exposing truths that seriousness avoids. People say things jokingly when they don't expect to be taken seriously, when they assume the listener will absorb it, soften it, or laugh it away. I used to be that listener. What changed wasn't my tolerance for humor. It was my willingness to ignore what it revealed. There's a moral here, but it isn't about leaving at the first sign of discomfort. It isn't about punishing people for thoughtless words. And it certainly isn't about dominance or winning. It's about listening fully, honestly, to what's being said and what's being assumed. It's about recognizing the difference between peace and silence, between stability and stagnation, between being valued and being relied upon. And it's about understanding that you don't owe anyone endless access to you just because you've always been accommodating. When someone jokes about losing you, pay attention, not with fear, but with clarity. Ask yourself whether your presence is being cherished or simply expected. Ask whether you're choosing your role or just continuing it because it's familiar. Leaving isn't always the right answer, but neither is staying quiet when something inside you is asking to be heard. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to know why. Have you ever laughed along with something that didn't feel like a joke to you? Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was being mistaken for permission? You're welcome to share your thoughts in the comments, not to judge, not to compare, just to speak honestly. Sometimes that's where the real shift begins.